Hello, everyone. My name is Hatem. I'm the regional organizer for the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. I welcome all of you today. Thank you for joining us. Um, and I would like to start by introducing PANA. PANA is an organization based in San Diego. And as an organization, we're committed to building power for our refugee community here in San Diego. As many of you know, San Diego is a hub for the refugee community. We have a large refugee community here in San Diego, and PANA uses advocacy and policy change as tools to building power for the refugee community here. So, for example, we advocate for more affordable housing for our refugee community here in San Diego. And in terms of policy change, we push for policies to end surveillance program on the Muslim and refugee community here in San Diego. So today's event is really important. We're here to share with you all about information on the federal surveillance program called Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE. We aim to explain the origins of CVE, how it operates in San Diego specifically, and discuss some tools and strategies we can use as organizations, community institutions, and community members to end CVE. We will demonstrate how CVE poses varying threats to the Muslim, immigrant, and refugee communities here in San Diego. And I'm happy to introduce and welcome our three speakers today. And I'll start with Hamad Allam. Hamad is a staff attorney in the National Security and Civic Rights Program at Asian American Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus. Asian Law Caucus has a deep history of leading anti-surveillance and anti-incarceration work on behalf of API and AMEMSA communities. Specifically, the National Security and Civil Rights Program is a team led by Muslim lawyers and community advocates working to protect the rights of AMEMSA communities throughout the Bay Area and across the state of California. Hamad's work focused, among other things, on the federal Countering Violence Extremism and state of California directly linked preventing violence extremism programs. Hamad has helped lead coalitions against both of these programs, helping devise strategies which engage policy advocacy, community organizing, and the law to place pressure on government actors to end and dismantle these harmful programs. Our second speaker for today is Yazan Zahza. Yazan is an organizer for the Majdal Center of El Cajon. The Majdal Center collaborates with the Arab refugee communities in San Diego to build foundation for political power and secure a more just future for all. Their work with the Majdal focuses on identifying and resisting the profiling and surveillance and repression in refugee spaces. Yazan is a master's candidate in women's studies at San Diego State University, researching the relationship between social services, surveillance, and counterinsurgency. They are a long-time organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement, USA. Lastly, we have Sara Farouk. Sara is currently serving on the board of the Muslim Student Association, MSA West, as the Advocacy Initiatives Director. In this position, she has led the Islamic Sacred Activism Cohort, a statewide organizing training program grounded in Islamic values, and has supported the advocacy needs of MSAs and Muslim students across California. As the advocacy director, she has also been engaged in coalitions to fight against surveillance, such as CVE and PVE, and more recently, TVTP. Overall, as a community advocate, Sara has engaged in issues like criminal injustice reform, immigration, justice, and anti-surveillance. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to start by posing a question for our panelists here. To start with giving a foundation for our attendees today, I would like you to help us understand CVE, the program Countering Violent Extremism. I would like to ask our panelists to give a brief overview of CVE. What's the goal and framework of this program, and why is it harmful for our community? Hamad, if you would like to go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey everyone, my name is Hamad Adam. Thanks Hatem and PANA for organizing this. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. You know, I would love to hear from the other panelists as well, because I think CVE has such a vast sort of history and there's so many different angles to cover. But one of the starting points that we can start off with is this idea of a radicalization theory that came out particularly from think tanks and research institutions, many of them conservative research institutions, sort of driven by Islamophobic philosophies and tendencies out of Europe. And yeah, basically the theory is sort of based on this idea that communities and individuals from certain backgrounds can be radicalized into violence, and that we can in fact predict such radicalization through what are called risk factors or indicators of that sort of violence. And one of the main issues with CVE, among many others, is the racialized assumptions that it tends to make about our communities of color, and particularly Muslim and Black and brown communities. So the prime example out of Europe, for instance, and a program on which CVE was modeled is the PREVENT program in the UK, which really grew out of the 7/7 sort of incidents and calls to really address the so-called sort of specter extremism in Europe. And as you can imagine, the focus of these programs, because of these roots, has undeniably been on Muslim, refugee, immigrant, Black and other communities of color. And so the Obama administration, in many ways, because of a response from communities of color, particularly Muslim communities in the United States in the 2000s, who were often subjected to really explicit forms of surveillance. When it came to programs like the NSEERS, which required individuals who were on immigrant visas or non-immigrant visas in this country from particular countries, which actually were a precursor to the Muslim ban. There were informants placed at masajid and other community centers. GPS tracking devices were placed on student activist cars. I remember that as an active student of MSA during my college years, and then Muslim, NYPD Muslim mapping program. And so I think, in many ways, the US government, and particularly the Obama administration, really wanted to kind of find a more palatable way to address national security and so-called sort of terrorism issues, but try to make it a community legitimized approach. And that really is what CVE is at the end of the day. It purports to be a community backed or community legitimized approach, but in fact ends up harming our communities because it takes the very saliency of our expression, whether it's religious or cultural or ethnic, and makes those small sorts of acts or moments of expression, whether it's religious worship, whether it's the way that we dress, whether it's the fact that we've traveled abroad, whether we've gone to Hajj or Umrah or gone to Iran for pilgrimage, speak a certain language. It actually criminalizes those things because, as I mentioned, the radicalization theory says, look, there are certain risk factors or indicators that might actually show us that some individual or communities actually have the propensity to commit violence. And in fact, this is deeply, deeply rooted in the history of the criminality of Black communities in this country since its very inception, right? This idea that criminality inheres in certain communities, that criminality is sort of just under the surface and it can bubble up at any moment. And so how do we then police and surveil these communities in a way that we can then really police their behavior and make sure that they're really not acting too saliently. So some of the risk factors and indicators that are identified are being more engaged in your masjid, being more engaged in the halaqah, in your study circle, being a part of an ethnic, cultural, religious student group on campus, being part of a political group that's very active on issues that are cutting against U.S. foreign policy interests, traveling abroad, and things like that. So really, that's kind of the history and the ways in which CVE programs often end up harming our communities. And I want to cede the floor to kind of pass it on for the other panelists.
For sure. I don't know if Sada, you wanted to go first, or No, I guess I just wanted to add a couple of points because I think Hamad, the way that you're framing it is really on point in terms of the relationship between the Barack Obama administration and CVE's launch. There was a lot of backlash that Bush administration got for these programs that Hamad was referencing, like NCERS, or if folks remember after 9/11, there was like those kinds of whispers of like just the list or these kinds of things. So there was a lot of anxiety around how the Bush administration handled the surveillance of Muslim communities and also Muslim-ish communities. So communities that are racialized, whether or not they are Muslim, if they come from countries that have Muslim populations. But I think something that's really important to uplift in what Hamad is talking about is CVE isn't instead of those other programs. CVE works with those other programs and still does those same things. And so part of why CVE came out, in the United States, it came out later than it did. Like the United States started it abroad several years before it started domestic programs here. But something that's important to name is the Obama administration first tried to secure a sort of informant system directly with community members. And so there were lots of surveys and there was lots of fielding that was done by federal agents in Arab Muslim, in South Asian Muslim, and in Black Muslim communities where they tried to gauge, can we just sort of get a list of informants from different communities across the US? And the response from these communities was, we're not interested in this. We're not going to engage in informancy work on our own communities. And so because of this sort of gap between community and the federal government was like, what can we secure to get the information that we want? And so they identified community partners as this missing link. And so that's where you have these grants that go to nonprofits, that go to masajid, that go to local K through 12 schools, police, local police precincts, or things like that, because the community already trusts these community partners. So the federal government doesn't have to worry about, oh, now these people don't trust us. The federal government has gotten the trust that these community partners already earned and is benefiting from it because they're giving grants to these community partners in the middle. And these grants will stipulate you need to check in with the Department of Homeland Security X times a year. For example, one of the grants that was written in San Diego stipulated that every grantee and subgrantee had to meet with DHS 3 to 4 times a year. So airfare was included as part of the grant that was rewarded. I think another really important thing to name really briefly is for us at Mejdal, a lot of what we look at is the relationship between United States military operations and countering violent extremism. Until 2020, so this year, the bureau that does warfare strategy for the United States is the same one that also was doing countering violent extremism. So it was called the Bureau of Counterterrorism and Countering Violent Extremism. And so the United States has a lot of operations that they are currently enacting in different parts of East Africa, different parts of the Levant, different parts of South Asia. And with that is where they are deploying CVE programs abroad and then CVE programs here. So something that's really important for us to think about in San Diego is a lot of our community members are community members who are displaced by what's called civil war, but usually it's US funded or actual US militarism in Somalia, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and then refugees come here and then are being serviced by CVE programs. So just thinking about the cyclical relationship between war and surveillance programs is also really important to add.
Yeah, thank you for the input, both Hamad and Yazan. I think one thing I was thinking about, and this is the first things that I thought about when I thought about CVE, is the kind of genius naming of it. You know, you think about countering violent extremism, and you tell that to anybody who doesn't have information or doesn't have the knowledge of what this program's purpose is. They'll say, yeah, of course I'm down for countering violent extremism. I would, who would want to be, you know, against that? And so I feel like with the structuring of it, in addition to kind of like having the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, back this program, the interesting thing about it is that DHS has been taking a very smart approach to policing and surveillance. They recognize that, you know, by sending FBI agents to those centers, which they still do, by the way, but when they send those agents and when they send those external folks into those communities that are not theirs, they see it as it requires more training, it requires more work on the DHS and the FBI part. And so they were like, you know what, let's just give the policing and surveillance to the communities and make it their job. And so now you see, instead of an external policing, an external surveillance work happening, now you see it internally within the community. And the problem with that is that CVE, based on the patterns that we've observed, based on the research that we've gathered and the different work that organizations have done, we're seeing a pattern of CVE directly affecting and targeting folks who are most vulnerable. And what does that look like? That looks like folks who are seeking mental health support. And you see that a lot of that in NorCal. You see a lot of organizations receiving, organizations centered around mental health support, suicide prevention, receiving money from the DHS to reduce violent extremism or radicalization. You see students on college campuses, most vulnerable students of color, Muslim students, Black, Indigenous people of color that are targeted by this programming. And it has a very similar trope to the Black identity extremism that we've seen by the FBI. And we see this kind of like intersection between not only the broader Muslim community, but the Black, Muslim, and non-Muslim communities that are being targeted by this programming. And so it's the struggle of surveillance and policing is not one that's targeting one community, but this state-sanctioned violence really is a mental and physical violence that's being inflicted on our communities, has been targeting a lot of different communities historically and still to this day. And you think about communities that provide direct services for folks, specifically in San Diego. That's kind of like what we've seen with CVE, directly trying to infiltrate those organizations. And the scary part about that is that folks don't have any other way. And especially with COVID right now, a lot of nonprofits are going to be struggling financially. And the DHS is seeing this as a strong opportunity to insert itself in those spaces, in those communities, to be like, we can provide financial support for you if you only do this, this, and that. And those instructions often entail surveillance on the communities and more data collection on communities that are more vulnerable, that are most vulnerable. And yeah, so, and I appreciate you guys from bringing up the point about, you know, being targeted abroad, but now you come to the US trying to seek refuge, quote unquote, and you come here and you're still being surveilled and targeted by that same government that destroyed your country. And I can definitely see that happening and continuing to happen, but we can definitely talk more about how CVE has this kind of like historical tying with other programmings that the US has inflicted.
Definitely. Sorry, all. Okay. I think, Sarah, you touched base on a really important point that I want us to really focus on, which is the intersectionality between other communities, right? This program does not only targets the Muslim community, the refugee community, also targets, you know, people of color, minorities in this country. And there's a deep history and a long history.
I hate niggers. I hate niggers.
That this program was built on.
Don't fucking breathe. Don't fucking breathe.
Sorry, everyone. Just give us a minute. Okay. So that was a distraction. Anyways, so the intersectionality piece. I'll ask you if you can describe the connection between CVE and the other programs that we have that have institutionally targeted people of color in this country. For example, the Countering program. We know that this program was used during the quote unquote war on drugs to target, you know, the Black liberation movement in this country and to infiltrate their organizations. Do you see a connection between CVE and Countering, for example?
If it's okay to speak to that a bit, I think one thing that's really important to uplift is with I think both Hamad and Sada referenced the Black identity extremism. That document specifically actually references Black Muslim autonomous movements in the United States as a threat. And I think we can see the relationship between Black identity extremism and COINTELPRO and its origins. And I think even with countering violent extremism, all of the scientists, like the social scientists, the anthropologists, the psychologists who've developed the theories like radicalization theory, and there's actually a few other social science theories that are also referenced, all of those people are actually counterterrorist scholars who are extremely Zionist and extremely pro-war. And so if you read those theories, they're all based on cases out of Palestine, out of Lebanon, out of Somalia. And so I think that when we're thinking about whether or not countering violent extremism is related to the war on drugs or related to COINTELPRO, definitely. Every single person who's referenced as an extremist in countering violent extremist language are, quote, non-state actors. And non-state actors on the transnational level usually references militia groups, usually references groups that are resisting US imperialism or other types of government corruption. In countering violent extremist rhetoric, you can be in a country if you are a military occupying it or if you are servicing it. And same thing on the domestic level. You can be in a community if you are a police officer or if you are a nonprofit who is surveilling the community. But everyone else and every other group or organization that has a critique of those presences are also categorized as extremist. And I think that this is inherently defined as counterinsurgency or as something that's working to infiltrate any sort of political work and autonomous work specifically.
I can speak more to that piece. Yeah, honestly, also just apologies for that. That was really disgusting and disturbing. It's really interesting how we're having this conversation and we're getting zoomed by that same energy. And so, yeah, we apologize for that for sure. Yeah, that was really distracting, but back to the topic of COINTELPRO. This is the same thing as we're talking about right now, surveillance, right? So us having to talk about these discussions and have these conversations and be afraid that someone is watching us. And now we know someone is watching us. But speaking of COINTELPRO, I think what's important to understand is there's kind of like in the toolkit that we created with Vigilant Love, Stop LAPD Spying, and PYM, we kind of like listed out the three main themes that we've seen across the different surveillance programs. And we've seen kind of like the three main hows, which are like infiltration, targeting leadership, and psychological warfare. And when you're talking about infiltration of leadership, infiltration in general, you're talking about you know, infiltration of community organizations, infiltration of community spaces. And that's the same thing that happened with COINTELPRO. You had physical infiltration of folks, wiretapping, all of these different tactics that the FBI utilized to silence and neutralize leadership. With targeting leadership also, with CVE, the DHS tries to target specific leaders in the community that have, you know, a certain voice that folks follow. And so by targeting those leaders, it's very difficult to kind of like create community trust. And so DHS goes after that community trust aspect of it and tries to break that down. And then you have psychological warfare, where folks don't really know who to trust at this point because their spaces have been infiltrated, their communities have been infiltrated. And so it's a very common thread, but also you talk about the war on terror and the war on drugs. Very similar rhetoric and very similar purposes. One is to criminalize Black folks and the other one is to quote unquote, put this radicalization theory, specifically targeting Muslim folks. But time after time, the state has to find a community to scapegoat, to blame, and to silence because they've dissented, you know, they're dissenting against the government and they're dissenting against the policies. And so it's really important for us to look at the rhetoric and how that rhetoric turns into actual policies.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
real quick, I would add, thank you for that, Sada and Yazin. I myself was sort of trying to gather myself for a little bit. Astaghfirullah. So I would just add one more thing to what was said, and I think Sada really touched on this as well, is this idea that CVE and programs like COINTELPRO really are premised upon this idea of assimilationism. And there's a sort of phenomenon or sort of like a normative baseline upon which a lot of these programs are premised, this idea of sort of a certain kind of white normativity, which essentially is a sort of a white supremacist baseline, and a certain kind of Judeo-Christian kind of identity, right? That is seen as essentially American, inherently American, and everything else is sort of cast as foreign or outside of sort of like the scope of what is normatively acceptable and palatable to the mainstream. And then it goes further because it becomes, it's cast as a dangerous other, right? It's cast as a criminal other. So CVE, frankly, is a part of a long history of policies, including COINTELPRO, that continue to this day, right? To police the identities of people of color so that they don't actually become like too much of themselves, right? They don't become too Muslim. They don't become too Black. They don't become, too Latinx, right? And as soon as they begin to cross those lines, right, in their political or religious or ethnic cultural expressions, they are deemed as a threat. And so, you have examples of this, the concentration of Japanese Americans, as opposed to Italian and German Americans. You have the surveillance of the farm workers movement in Cesar Chavez, right? And then you have the Muslim and African bans today. They have a certain vision of, that's articulating a certain vision of who is actually in the American fabric, according to what, sort of normative, authority says, and who is actually out. So really that's something to consider, because if you look at those risk factors and, indicators that we had talked about, it's really this idea of all of these different things that are frankly, arguably First Amendment protected activities of just sort of being yourself, being a practicing Muslim, being someone who is a vocal, social justice advocate, who comes from a community of color, like sort of deep, like, minority community background. That as soon as those saliencies are taken up, a step too far.
When you look at something like this and you look at community members who are coming from contexts where they are regularly profiled by the police or they have been displaced by US militarism, it becomes important to question what it means for countering violent extremism to focus so heavily on building police relations. And I think the last thing is also thinking about the University of San Diego is a school that does a lot of the school that it was under is their peace and conflict studies. So they do a lot of international studies work that goes to the United Nations. University of San Diego directly does a lot of work with pacification and counterterrorism, and they are in countries all over the world that have ongoing struggles against either US imperialism or local corruption, and Muslim resistance groups that engage in a resistance of that corruption or that violence are the ones that the University of San Diego works to target abroad. And so thinking a lot about how the University of San Diego sort of is a really local example of how CVE is domestic and international all at once. It's helping create the context in countries like Syria or like Lebanon or like Somalia. Their most recent program was in Kenya, where there are a lot of Somali refugees. They are folks who are working there to counter violent extremism there, promote more US militarism abroad, and then folks get displaced here. And that was really, really jumbled. I'm sorry. There's a lot that I think we found in the last couple of years.
Oh, definitely. It's an entire report or a community brief. There's a lot of information, but I have like a specific question here. Are they targeting a specific community here in San Diego or specific geographic areas in San Diego? And how much money they're putting into this program here locally?
So the specific areas in San Diego that are most targeted by countering violent extremism are City Heights, where you have an enormous East African population, and then El Cajon, where you have a majority of the Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees outside of Chaldean communities. The grant that University of San Diego they applied for 900,000, they were awarded about 630,000, but that's just one grant. So San Diego also has Preventing Violent Extremism funding going through it through the 211. And San Diego also the University of San Diego has other ways that they engage in countering violent extremist work, and similar to San Diego PD and the JTTF here. So there's a lot of partnerships that use countering violent extremist ideas. So there's a lot more funding that goes into it besides that one grant.
I just wanted to add one thing to that really quickly. Yes. You touched on a lot of a lot of the main kind of like the scene in San Diego is, and so that was a pretty good comprehensive summary. I think one thing I'll add really quickly is the sort of parallels that I see between PVE programming and gang documentation and gang injunctions. And this is something that is very prevalent in San Diego, particularly areas like Southeast San Diego, where you have majority Black and Brown communities being targeted by police and documented as gang members. And you have areas of gang injunctions where folks can be labeled as gang members and put in a gang database. And the qualities or like the list that they have for you to qualify as a gang member is like you wear a certain color, you identify with certain folks, you use certain symbols and taking pictures or your social media. So a lot of your behavior is policed. The areas that you live or work can also be a way for you to be documented as a gang member. And there's a lot of parallels between that. And actually PVE programming has relied heavily on gang documentation systems to implement PVE, preventing violent extremism in K-12 education. And that's how they kind of identified students that are prone to radicalization, quote unquote. And it's indicators like you observe your holidays a little too much, you miss school for a certain number of times, and your teachers are mandated reporters on your behalf. So it's very interesting how the environment for students and for youth, and I see it being like Black Muslim youth being the biggest targets of CVE and PVE programming in San Diego, but in general as well. So it's very interesting how the most vulnerable folks are the targets of that surveillance in San Diego.
Yeah, I would just say, so I should have said this at the start. Both Yazin and Sada are actually from San Diego, so I'm kind of the non-San Diegan one here. But I just want to like sort of identify that positionality. But real quick, I would mention that in addition to the federal government itself, which, Yazin had mentioned, the University of San Diego, they received, I think, one of the biggest, if not the biggest grant from the DHS. But there's also, and this is a campaign that we have a very strong, robust coalition around. MSA West is a part of it. Vigilant Love is a part of it. PANA, MassPace, and a number of other organizations are part of the No PVE in California coalition. So you might ask yourself, what is PVE? Well, it's called Preventing Violent Extremism. It's the state's version of CVE. And what we found through the past year of organizing around this issue is that the state of California itself is actually deeply invested in these types of so-called counterterrorism programs. So you not only have the federal government involved, you actually have the state of California really looking to take up these types of national security and surveillance strategies. And the program itself, PVE, comes out of California's Office of Emergency Services, which is sort of the federal government's, or the state of California's really kind of, I guess you could say, a corollary to the federal FEMA, which is housed under DHS. And what we found is that DHS and Office of Emergency Services in the state of California have had a deep history of collaboration dating back to, frankly, around 10 years ago of actually devising countering violent extremism programs in the state. And so one of their grants that they came out with in a pilot program about 2 or 3 years ago is actually centered in San Diego and was given to 211 San Diego, which from what I understand is a huge resource, particularly for immigrant and refugee communities in San Diego, and in fact has been engaged in what's called the Violence Prevention Network in San Diego that involves government agencies like DHS, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the DA's office. By the way, note that the Public Defender's Office is not engaged in that whatsoever. So you see these sort of prosecutorial, law enforcement-oriented organizations or government agencies that are working closely with universities like University of San Diego, UC San Diego State, and then a number of other organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League. So at which, as Yazin had mentioned, there are these sort of Zionist and imperialistic connections that you can make across the world with these programs. So it wasn't a significant amount of money. 125,000 was granted to 5 different organizations across the state. But what we do know is that this entire program out of the state of California is actually entirely funded by DHS. And so, we need to sort of recognize that this is something that is deeply embedded in the ways in which even so-called progressive states are actually addressing these, sort of purported issues with violent extremism in our communities. And what I can tell you is that the 5 grantees that received money from the state of California, almost all of them work with either students of color. So in San Bernardino County, for instance, we have a school district 90% Latinx and Black student enrollment, and you had teachers being trained to identify violent extremism amongst that population that is already criminalized and already subject to high rates of school discipline that lead them down the school to prison pipeline. And then you have a number of other grants as well, given to Sacramento, an organization working there with refugees and immigrants, as well as 211 San Diego, as I mentioned. So just want to say that this is a multifaceted sort of issue. And frankly, there are so few of us really working on this issue. So the more that you learn about it, and if you want to get engaged, please be in touch with any of us, because the more people that we have engaged on this issue, the better it is for our communities, frankly.
Definitely, Hamad. And this event and other events are part of, educating the community, giving the information out for our community, so we can build up the momentum and the momentum to fight this program. I want to go into the schools. Sarah, I know you're on the board of MSA, and we've talked about CVE and PVE, that they do not only exist in communities or government. They also exist in schools, in universities. So what does it look like inside the school system?
Yeah, so on college campuses, what's sort of like happening is that you have different iterations of CVE happening across California specifically, but different iterations across campuses in general. And you have sort of centers being created for CVE, or CVE funding going towards diversity and equity centers, which is very interesting. And those centers are often trying to create quote unquote safe spaces for students, which it really isn't. And so the problem with that is that, student activism, specifically for Muslim students, it's very difficult as it is because of post 9/11 and the current climate. But now you have this added layer of fear that students have to face now. And and we've seen this interestingly with MSA West. We've asked our student constituents in one of the surveys, and we were like, so how do you think surveillance affects your activism on campus? And the majority of them said it really hesitate. It reduces their likelihood of engaging in any political activism because of surveillance. And so you have this kind of added fear factor in students, and instilling that fear within them that you don't have the right to politically dissent, or your activism is consistently surveilled and looked at. And for me personally, as somebody who's I consider myself, I guess, still a student because I have one more summer class, but with me being a student, it's kind of like, it's not the most pleasant experience when you're constantly afraid of whether your words will be used against you to dox you. And we've seen this recently with Bears for Palestine in Berkeley, where folks spoke out against Zionism and they were doxxed. And so there's a lot of different systems placed to silence the dissent of students or any political activism that students, particularly Black and Muslim students, that they engage in. And so it's this added layer of fear. And me, speaking on this platform, right, even though I'm not physically present anywhere to have this conversation, I'm still scared that if I have my full name on this program right now, that somebody might use it and take a picture of me and spread it around. So it's this kind of you are, silenced, and you're afraid to speak up because of the consequences that you think you're going to face. and particularly folks from refugee immigrant backgrounds who have, like for myself, being naturalized. And so having that, even though I'm a citizen and that's a privilege on its own, that can be taken away at any moment under the guise of national security. And so that fear that students have to face really disrupts their leadership, and it really reduces community trust amongst on campus and off campus. So students are now stuck in this bubble, afraid to really engage in political activism because of those different systems at place. And I'll give you an example too. At UC Berkeley in 2017, we had a class that professors who were in the Department of Defense were teaching students how to create CVE programming on their campuses and implement it abroad too. And now a new iteration of a similar class is happening in UCI, University of Irvine. And so there's a lot of different ways that CVE has infiltrated college campuses, but students are now at risk of those programs and of being surveilled. And that's kind of like the issue with surveillance as a whole, is that it's not that an after effect is the fear from engaging in activism. It's a direct effect. Surveillance doesn't want you to engage in activism or any political organizing, and wants to silence our communities. And that's kind of like the thing that, students have to recognize and work against and fight against. So that's definitely like a big fight.
Thank you, Sarah. Yazan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly also that on the other side of it, there's a lot of money that goes into universities to create these studies, to create research. So whole departments are also creating a lot of literature around this. I think a really clear example is UCLA and their partnership with LAPD. And so there's also, like Sada's referencing, student activism and the impact that CVE has, which is huge. And then on the flip side, there's also a lot of money going into universities for them to create more of that thought, which is also really important to consider. And then I think just with one other point about universities and student activism, the way that Countering Violent Extremism, Sada, at the beginning, which I really appreciate that you named how it's called Countering Violent Extremism, a lot of people buy into it because it's so liberal sounding. And so right now, Countering Violent Extremism is making its way into other universities in San Diego. And if you attend the webinars and the information settings that the people who are bringing Countering Violent Extremism to these universities, like they're hosting, the way that they talk about it, you think you are watching a social justice presentation for Muslims. You think that you are watching something that is like, wow, they care about the empowerment and the respect of Islam. They don't want Islamophobia. They're against Islamophobia. I attended one of these webinars and it was an hour just looking at how Islamophobia is bad and how government shouldn't enact Islamophobia. And so it's really hard for a lot of people to look at something like that and think of it as a surveillance program, or think of it as something that's somehow racist or Islamophobic. And so I think with what Sada's naming, when you have a lot of university students who maybe aren't activists or maybe aren't politicized, and then see something like this, and then are asked at the end of the webinar to sign a pledge that they're willing to counter violent extremism, it becomes like this sort of trick that a lot more people that were on the fence or unknown now are getting buy-in from the Department of Homeland Security, which I think is really important.
One more thing quickly, sorry. One more thing that I wanted to just add to Yazan's point is the language that people have to pay attention to. A lot of things that are said are not only deemed or presented in a way that's not Islamophobic, but also they use vocabulary in words like resilience, building community, empowerment. And so we really have to be careful with the framing of it because they're doing that on purpose.
There's a lot to talk about. I have 2 more questions and we have 7 minutes, so we'll see if we can make it. But recently, MSA West, the Palestinian Youth Movement, the Stop LAPD, Spine Coalition, and a lot of other organizations released a CVE toolkit for campuses. So can you tell us about it and what's the idea behind it?
Mm-hmm. So the idea behind the toolkit actually came from the conversations that I had with student leaders on campus. So when I was still in school, I would have these conversations with folks being like, are you familiar with CVE? Have you heard of it? And when I presented the idea to them, they were like, yeah, that sounds good. That doesn't sound like we have nothing to hide. That's the statement that was always said. And they didn't necessarily understand how CVE itself played into a historical timeline of surveillance and how it fit into that. And so the issue with that is that there was a big disconnect and a big gap that folks had in their knowledge of surveillance and policing. And so what the toolkit does is that it starts with that framing, that historical framing, to help folks understand how CVE and PVE programming fits into that. And it starts with, and we start the toolkit with the historical framing from the Japanese internment. And you look at the internment of folks and how they were targeted, how their leadership was infiltrated, the very same tactics and themes that we found throughout all of these surveillance and policing programmings. And then we go into COINTELPRO, how that affected Black leadership and civil rights movement. And then you go into post 9/11, and then you go into LAPD predictive policing and how predictive policing measures have impacted Black and Brown communities and tremendously increased policing of those communities and criminalization, of course. And so you have to see CVE and PVE fitting into this historical framework and trend for you to really understand why it's even there in the first place. And so we look at that and then we present it from kind of like, you know, a campus perspective, because we want the information to be simple and presentable for folks to really understand what CVE is about. And so we go into kind of like not only the general overview of what surveillance has looked like, but why you should care. So we try to talk to folks about, you know, the different impacts of CVE and the impacts of CVE on students and campuses, like I talked about earlier, but also what you can do on your individual campuses to organize. And this guide includes ways that students themselves, and this is honestly a tool for empowerment, to make students not only understand how CVE affects their communities and their campuses, but also how to target it. Because what's interesting about surveillance, and this is something that Asya Bundawi mentioned in her movie, the feeling of being watched, is that the simplest act we can do against those surveillance programs is make them know that we are watching them. And that's the work that coalitions have been doing and engaging in, either on the national front or the statewide front. And so we go into that, and then we talk about the different tools that students can utilize to engage in that work, to identify how CVE has affected their campuses, through PRAs and other tools, and ways that they can, you know, join the work that's already happening.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And I think people can access it on MSA's website, the PYM website, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. It's a really important tool for our students and youth to use, as Sarah said, to understand CVE and PVE, and to also learn about different ways that you can target this program on your campuses. I want to go back to something that Yazan earlier, talked about, which is it's hard to identify CVE programs. It was developed under the Democrats. It's liberal. They use the terms that we use in organizing spaces, empowering refugees, empowering. So how can we identify CVE programs and initiatives as community members? And what would we do with the information when we identify those programs? And the question is for all of you.
I think on the local level, any event that is a social event between police and community, that is 99% going to be countering violent extremism. So if you don't have access to the language of the organization or the grants, looking at the programming that's happening, if it pushes for things that pushes the community to relate to police, or if it pushes for empowerment that doesn't reference political issues or social justice, I think just looking at the programming is a really simple way. But there's a lot of other ways, but I know that I'm sure Sada and Hamad have some, and I know we're short.
Yeah, I guess Sada had touched on this, and there's probably a comprehensive list of these terms in the MSA West Toolkit. I think there is, but there's certain terminology that's often used in a lot of these programs. So building resilience, or resilience is one of them. Managing interventions is another. This idea of interdiction, which literally means actually arrest and prosecution of individuals and involving law enforcement and prosecutorial offices directly. So I would encourage you to really look at that MSA West toolkit to kind of identify what the markers might be of CVE programming. And similar to what Yazin just mentioned, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and if anyone has this like idea or an interest in it, please message me. I'll maybe drop my email address. But I think we really need to mobilize across the state, and this is from like a sort of Muslim community perspective when it comes to masajid engaging law enforcement. Because what I can say is that as an attorney and someone who's been working on anti-police issues for a while, law enforcement necessarily have a mandate of criminalization. That's literally their job. That's literally what they do. They really don't have much of an interest in really providing for the well-being or mental health or the welfare as much as they kind of build that sort of narrative of communities, and certainly not communities of color. And in fact, if you look at there's been a lot of talk, for instance, with LAPD and the fact that they had a budget of $3 billion, which, I mean, for those of us who have been working on these issues, really came as no surprise. Granted, it was reduced to 1.8 billion, but they literally act as a sort of for-profit institution. If you're not growing, then you're actually failing. And so every single year, they actually try to get more and more money. So, 10 years ago, it was just 700 million. Now it's, 1.8 billion, right? So I think that's important to consider, because what ends up happening because of it is that there are metrics established, right? I mean, just like a for-profit institution needs to show that they're actually doing the work, police departments show that they're doing the work by actually criminalizing communities, right? So that's literally what they do. So when it comes to, traditional sort of masjid engagement with law enforcement, I think that is often a huge red flag. And not to mention the fact that this is, frankly, it plays into, I think, the pervasive anti-Black issues that play out within immigrant Muslim communities, not recognizing the deep history of criminalization and also just the sort of oppression, right, of our communities of color, and particularly Black communities from the history of this country. And so, to the extent that there are issues involving, sort of concerns around violence upon masajid, there are ways in which, and frankly, a lot of, Black masajid have been doing this for a very long time, of really, creating the infrastructure for safety for your own community. Which sort of goes beyond a lens of police interacting with community members through frankly an exclusive lens of criminality, but also really just understanding the issue through a is there a crime committed? Okay, can we make an arrest? And then we just incarcerate the individual, right? Because that is a sort of model of law enforcement and criminalization in this country. So I would say that really to the extent that you have a local masjid that you've seen the sheriff's department or police officers coming in and saying, hey, and some of them will like drop salams to kind of get that legitimacy, really view that with suspicion and get in touch with your board members and say, hey, have a conversation around this.
Thank you all for all of the different things that you brought up today and raised. I think we also need to realize that CVE, PV are big programs, and one webinar isn't enough to cover the different things that are happening with this program here. I want to open it up for questions. So please, if you have a question, you can send it to me directly or to the Zoom chat. Also for people on Facebook, you can ask it on the Facebook chat, and we're happy to take it. So let's open it up. And also, Yazan, Sarah, if you feel comfortable sharing your email or the information about the organization that you represent for community members who are interested in being involved in campaigns to target CVE programs, PVE programs. You can reach out definitely to the Majdal Center, to PANA. This webinar is the beginning of our work around CVE. We're not going to stop here. This program is harmful for our community, and we know that we have committed community organizers and institutions who really want to fight this program, and here locally, on a state level and nationally. So if you want to be involved and you want to learn more about this program, please reach out to us.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly uplift that. We are involved in a coalition, MSA West, Vigilant Love, Stop LPD Spying, and PYM, Palestinian Youth Movement, in a statewide coalition to address CVE and educate folks on the impacts of CVE and ways that we can strategize and organize against those programs. It's the Students and Communities Against Policing and Surveillance. I've linked the email in the chat, so if you're interested in learning more about it and getting in contact with folks, we are planning to have more webinars and information on CVE and ways that we can fight against it. So if you're interested, hit us up with the email.
Okay, I have a question from Aya. Aya, first, I'm gonna read your message. Thank you all for the insight and information. I'm curious if you all have any advice for how to address this with higher education institutions and leadership. She really appreciate it if you have any advice.
Can you repeat it? I'm sorry, I just didn't hear the last part.
Sure. So if you have any advice on how to address, CVE and the issues that this program imposes for our community with higher education institutions that have those programs, and our leadership, leadership in the educational system, educational institutions, and outside in the community in general.
One thing I can say to that is utilizing the tools that are available to find that information. I think the first step really is to do a simple Google search of your institution and being like, UC Berkeley, Countering Violent Extremism, and you'll be surprised of what you'll find. And going deeper into that research, but also in the toolkit itself, we have information, like we have utilized the full campus. It's a condensed CVE campus report. It's linked in the toolkit. You can find it there, and it tells you very detailed information about individual campuses across California. So if your campus is one of them, you can find more information about that instead of reinventing the wheel. But also when it comes to finding out more information, filing PRA Public Records Act request, and what that really does is that you can look into the records and find information about your college campus if it's a public institution, and find ways that they've collaborated or any affiliations that they have with CVE and DHS programming through that. We have a PRA guide that we've included in the toolkit, so if you need to just learn more information on that, because I know it's seen as something that only like attorneys can do, even though everyone can do that work. It just needs consistency and work in that. So I that's one way you can do it. If you have questions on PRAs and ways that we can support you, you can contact the coalition. I think also Hamad is available for support if folks need it. And just getting involved in the local work that's happening, but also trying to utilize the work that's been done by these coalitions to uplift it on your own individual campus. So if it means having a workshop on your campus to engage in that discussion and engage in that conversation, maybe reaching out to that individual that's a leader in that program that's implementing CVE and talking about them and having a conversation with them on why they've implemented and accepted that money. So I think it really, it kind of like takes up research, but also education that you need to do for that work.
Definitely. I also want to add that, I think it's on all of us as community organizations to really continue doing webinars like this, to continue launching campaigns in our locale, where we build coalitions and work with our local institutions and leadership to really build, a movement around this program and really spread, consciousness among our community members and etc. Hamad, do you want to
Yeah,
add?
and I wanted to quickly mention a positive note. Yazin, Vision Love, Mass-Based PANA, all these organizations that I listed earlier, we've been part of this No PV in California coalition. Our fight is still continuing, but we actually organized around educating state electeds. Now, normally I'm the type to say that, movement building from the outside, or really placing pressure from that perspective is sort of the default. But in this case, because of the fact that we had a state agency involved that was receiving funding, was actually explicitly asking for funding from the state to implement its Preventing Violent Extremism program, we actually began really educating electeds, especially those who sit on the State Committee on Budget, who actually make those sorts of public safety spending, et cetera, decisions that oversee that sort of agency and its work. And we mobilized, we educated, we really made sure that we had our research down. We mobilized community members to our meetings with electeds, and we showed up to the 2 days of hearings that were actually quite taxing, but we showed up with public comment, and we were actually able to move the Committee on Budget to a position that, frankly, I think a lot of us may not have imagined when we started this campaign a year ago, and actually got them to reject a particular request from the state agency for further state funding, which would have actually, besides the fact that they received federal funding, the reality is that if the state would have given it funding, it would have legitimized it from the state perspective. At least now we were able to sort of disrupt that effort. And that's part of the ongoing process to continue to educate, those who are in those positions and sort of do that power mapping. And just want to end on that positive note, that we're really anticipating that is going to be in the final budget, where it's going to be a rejected line item, and the state's going to say, look, we're not going to be funding this out of state dollars. And that just shows you the power of mobilizing on this issue. It's a very difficult issue. I can honestly say that when it comes to these types of issues, as Sada and Yazid mentioned, they sound so benign, right? I mean, everybody who's sort of unsuspecting can really think that this is actually a positive, not just from outside of our communities, but inside of our communities. But this just goes to show you that when you actually take up education, when you do your work and really mobilize community and show the impacts, that it can really make a difference. So just wanted to sort of plug that positive sort of note.
Yeah, thank you, Hamad. Thank you, definitely. I have two more questions. One of the questions, are there differences between the way CVE affects Latinx communities in SD as opposed to Muslim/Black communities?
So countering violent extremism, because of the indicators that it relies on and because of its dependency on specifically indicators around both migration status, but also Islam and race and ethnicity, the countries that are usually referenced as potentially dangerous countries are most often countries that have associations with what's called ISIS, Daesh, Al-Shabaab, and then more broadly, you'll get into Al-Qaeda and these different things. And so through the language that the government uses, countering violent extremism most often targets people who are either from countries that these organizations operate in, or who are racialized as people who are coming from these countries. And so that's not to say that countering violent extremism wouldn't increase policing in general, but very much so the primary targets are folks who are lumped into this Muslim-ish category. Preventing violent extremism, so the one that kind of Hamad was touching on and other folks have been touching on, that's a program that more directly relates to Black and brown youth, like very, very generally. And I think Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has actually done a lot of work on the relationship between the war on terror and the war on, they call it the war on youth, looking at the relationship between the racialization of folks who are typically like consolidated into gang categories, and then the racialization of people as terrorists. And so a really popular example is Donald Trump's consolidation of ISIS and MS-13 from El Salvador. So that program, Preventing Violent Extremism, we haven't talked a lot about it, but that usually exists in K through 12 schools. Hamad was talking about the teachers in San Bernardino who'd received the training. That is where you'll see Latinx and Black youth who aren't necessarily Muslim being targeted and racialized by DHS programming. So again, countering violent extremism most often relies on Islamophobic rhetorics and mostly targets folks through that. And then you'll see through preventing violent extremism, this broader racialization of working class, and sometimes middle class, Black and brown folks. But I will say that there is a really also, like, it's not in this direct conversation, but there is a link because of ICE's relationship to the Department of Homeland Security between countering violent extremism, DHS, and looking at folks who are undocumented or have risky situations in the Latinx community.
Thank you, Yazan. My final question for you all is, why should non-Muslims, non-refugees, immigrants care about CVE? And yeah, so why do communities who are not impacted by CVE, PVE care about this program? And how does this program affect them, if it does affect them?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
It's a hard
Sorry.
question. Why non-Muslim, non-refugees, non-immigrant communities should care about the CVE program and stopping the CVE program, you know? Does it affect them? That's also another question.
Do you want to tackle that, or do you want me to go for it?
I mean, I'll just simply say that you know, what I said earlier, right, around kind of the saliency of expression of our identities at stake here. The fact that, and, you know, Sada had mentioned there's a chilling impact on the speech and the sort of modes of expression that students can take up in certain spaces, because sort of the idea of surveillance is such a looming threat, right? Constant looming threat. And frankly, that's across the board when it comes to CVE and the communities that it impacts. But the reality is that, you know, our identities are not fixed, right? I mean, we can sort of transition in and out when it comes to our political opinions, whether it's our cultural expressions, the people that we associate with. I mean, it even gets to that level, right? Where all the First Amendment sort of protected activities of religious, you know, cultural expression, speech, political opinion, as well as freedom of association are implicated. So I would say certainly communities of color, and Yazan mentioned, you know, particularly that San Bernardino County, you know, grant that was given to train teachers. I mean, how preposterous is this, right? 90%, you know, Latinx and Black student enrollment, and you're teaching, you know, training teachers to identify violent extremism amongst that student population. So clearly we know that it's not just sort of a Muslim-centric issue. You know, but certainly want to emphasize that there is the sort of Islamophobic frame, and also, I mean, with LGBTQ students, for instance, or youth, this idea that when they're exploring sort of different parts of their identities, or really just understanding who they are and what their place might be, the sort of vitriolic sort of system that we have that is so anti-LGBTQ, that they can actually fall into you know, radicalization, right? So I think it's important to understand that these frameworks, in fact, even though the sort of evidence indicates that the majority of them have focused on Muslim and Black communities and brown communities, they can actually be applied in almost every context, right? I mean, the example of the ways in which obviously Black identity extremism was mentioned, but even, you know, environmental activists are surveilled, right, with the same sorts of frameworks. So that just goes to show us that these frameworks really are sort of plug and play in a lot of ways. So I'll stop there, but just wanted to mention that, you know, at the end of the day, our saliencies of identity, no matter where we come from, should always be respected and should be preserved. And that if we're engaging in sort of even a tacit condoning or sort of an absence of speaking out against these issues, then frankly, it's going to end up impacting all of us.
One thing I'll quickly add to that is that, you know, when we talk about surveillance and policing, sometimes people tend to see them as different systems, but the issue with that is that those systems are actually interconnected and they reinforce each other. and they rely on the same, rhetoric that it's recycled material basically. And you'll see that in the toolkit that we created with the historical framing, is that it's the same tactics, same themes time and time again, but it's different people that they're targeting, and it's different different communities that they are scapegoating. But with that comes the understanding that we can't fight against one system, not the other. We have to be actively fighting against both at the same time. And that's the importance of bringing together different communities and not having this fight be centered just in Muslim communities, but also in communities that are affected by PVE, for example, and by policing in general. I mean, we're having this conversation about defund police. We're having this conversation about how policing is affecting our Black brothers and sisters specifically. And we need to understand that those conversations are deeply interconnected with surveillance of our communities. And we need to understand that to fight against surveillance is to fight against policing, and vice versa. And yeah, it's not just, you can't just pick your fights and choose which system you want to fight against, but understanding and realizing how those systems operate together